The Orillia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our latest installment of the History Speaker Series. I have some amazing people on screen here with me who I will introduce to you. But before I do, I have a couple thank yous. Firstly to Deanne, who is our partner over at Rogers TV, where they have been airing these talks after the fact. And they're a great partner for us to have. We're very lucky. Thank you to Marianne Grant and the OMAH-History Committee, without whom this event would not be possible. Thanks to Monica, who you're seeing on screen, for making the beautiful posters that you've been seeing as we advertise. So here on screen, I can introduce to you Monica, of course, who is the operations coordinator at the Orillia Museum of Art and History. No doubt many of you will have interacted with her already. I have Trish Crogrand as well, who is the head of that OMAH-History Committee that I mentioned. My name is Lindsay. I'm the History Programming Coordinator at OMAH. And then, of course, I have our fantastic speaker who I now get to introduce. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sylvie Browne, who is the daughter of longtime OMAH members and supporters, Jennifer and Bob Browne, and the granddaughter of tonight's topic, renowned sculptor Elizabeth Wyn Wood. Tonight's talk is the story of Sylvie's grandmother, and it's also related to two works that were recently acquired by OMAH for the permanent collection. Now, we had some dresses and whatnot that were donated to OMAH, but these are actually the first two of Elizabeth Wyn Wood's artworks that are included in our collection. So we're just over the moon to have them as part of our collection at the museum. And it's fairly fitting that we get to hear the story of an amazing female sculptor from Orillia who made such an impact in her field shortly after March 8th marked International Women's Day. So Sylvie, thank you so much for being online with us this evening. We're so thrilled to have you and to hear your conversation about your grandmother. So without further ado, take it away.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I would like to begin by giving credit for all the help that I had in creating this talk. You're hearing my voice, but this presentation draws on many sources of information. I should be sharing my screen. Share. Okay, everybody can see? First of all, most of my knowledge comes from the 56 years that I was privileged to hear stories from my mother, Jennifer Browne, who was the only child of Elizabeth Wyn Wood and Emmanuel Hahn. As a little kid, she canoed with her parents. Here she is out camping in the Georgian Bay area. And as a 5-year-old, she was sculpted with her teddy bear in this formal portrait by her mother. I have also had the benefit of insights from each of my sisters who have their own experiences of growing up with our grandparents' art. Jennifer, up in the left-hand corner, once said that we had all inherited designer genes, which we express in our own lives. In the middle are my sisters, and I will introduce them from left to right. Sydney is an architect. I am an archaeologist and mapping technologist. Nigama studied art history in Toronto, Montreal, and Paris. Sybil's business career has always included strong patronage of the arts, and Aurora had a small business painting her own compositions before her career as an actress took off. Our father, Bob Browne, and you can see him up on the right as well as in the middle of the photograph, never met Emmanuel Hahn, but he had vivid recollections of the first time he was introduced to Elizabeth, where he soon realized that Kennifer came from a family of very talkative thinkers. He was always supportive of Kennifer's work on behalf of her parents, and when she could not attend the opening of the Wyn Wood exhibit in 1997, he stepped up with a keynote address about Elizabeth as a teacher. I have learned so much from the catalog written by Victoria Baker in 1997 for the National Gallery of Canada's touring retrospective of Hahn and Wood. It was the result of 6 years of painstaking research, and Kennifer was very grateful for Victoria's friendship and curatorial skill. Finally, I have benefited from all of those institutions and private researchers who've put their work on the internet for me to find whenever I Google my grandparents and their circle. You may remember seeing this Hall of Fame banner in 2017 when Orillia was celebrating its sesquicentennial. Or you have perhaps visited the Orillia Library, where you can see this beautiful marble bust of Elizabeth Wyn Wood, sculpted by her husband. Also on display are Elizabeth's large bronze busts of Stephen Leacock and Charles Harold Hale. And if you went to Orillia Collegiate, you may remember her portrait bust of Premier Leslie Frost. Perhaps you have sat in Victoria Park in front of the leaping deer in its new granite setting. Or as members of OMAH, you probably saw these exhibits in 2015 and 2017, both curated by Kennifer. To me, this sculptor, Elizabeth Wyn Wood, was my granny, who I knew as a little girl. This photograph was taken by my father at her home in York Mills Valley in 1963, when I was 2 years old. Here, Elizabeth, in the center back, is talking with her sister Elmo, while my mother, sitting in the middle, holds her newborn baby, my sister Sydney, and chats with her sister-in-law, my Aunt Jan, who's holding the camera. And meanwhile, my grandmother Brown, from my other side of the family, keeps me from wandering off. This photograph was taken on the occasion of our christening in Toronto at the same church where my parents had been married. Betty Wood was the youngest daughter of a family who ran a dry goods store on Mississauga Street. She was born at their cottage on Cedar Island, which they called the Wood Box, and grew up in the big house on West Street, which they called Westward Ho. She spent as much time on the lake as Orillians do today, learning to swim and canoe. As a child, she was given plasticine to play with, and she decided very soon that she wanted to be not just an artist, but a sculptor. In 1921, Betty, whom you can see on the left-hand side, in the middle of her, she's at the front of this group of friends, enrolled in the Ontario College of Art, newly established at their Grange campus in Toronto. Here, her teachers included a group of 7 members, Arthur Lismer and J.E.H. MacDonald. So in this portrait on the right-hand side, from the left is MacDonald, and then third from the left is Lismer, and second from the right is A.Y. Jackson, all of them members of the group of 7. The curriculum included a lot of drawing, painting, and graphic arts. 2 landscapes that Betty painted as summer assignments already show her awareness of light and mass, trees, landforms, and clouds. Even her historical painting of the flight into Egypt has many landscape elements. The tree and the night sky catch your eye as much as the figures of Mary and Joseph and their baby. The dark colors and the position of the figures with their backs to the viewer express how much this young family was traveling far from home in a strange land. Betty's most important classes were in modeling and casting, taught by Emmanuel Hahn, who was on the right-hand side of the portrait in the last slide, and here is on the right-hand side of this class photograph. Emmanuel was immediately impressed by the fact that she was the first woman he had ever met who always carried a sharp knife. Emmanuel Hahn had his own love for the Canadian wilderness, especially the Georgian Bay area, which he had been exploring for years with his brothers and sisters. In 1908, he bought an island in the Pickerel River near the historic French River canoe route. Here, he hosted his sisters, his students, and other artists and friends. In these two photographs, we see his students Carl Schaefer, Lowry Warner, John Byers, and also his sister, Anna Hahn. Many of them painted and drew their own views of the island. For example, in the upper left-hand corner, we see a pen and ink sketch by his sister, Rosemary Hahn, made from the south end of the island as she sees it from the water. Carl Schaefer, his student and later a painter and teacher himself, created a woodcut-like drawing of one of the little cabins on Monaghan's Island. Lowry Warner, another student and one of Canada's first abstract painters, depicted the same cabin at night with bats flitting about catching mosquitoes. And friends such as Parasceva Clark painted this view of the south end of the island in one of her few landscapes. By 1925, Monty and Betty were secretly engaged, as you can tell by these very intimate sketches that they made of each other. And after her postgraduate year at Ontario College of Art, they were married very quietly in September of 1926, and they spent their honeymoon on the island. Here's a small photograph of that time. And my parents spent their own honeymoon there in 1960. That fall, she took further graduate courses at the Art Students League of New York. When she returned to Toronto to establish herself as a professional artist and teacher, she was now known as Elizabeth Wyn Wood. Basically, she slimmed down her middle name and used it to enhance her last name of Wood. With her first finished works, such as this Man and Woman, she made it clear that she was a modernist. Elizabeth's stated ambition as a sculptor was to create monuments. In 1915, when she was still in high school, her hometown had commissioned a monument to Samuel de Champlain and the 300th anniversary of his exploration of the Orillia area. They asked the same sculptor, Vernon March, who later designed the National War Memorial in Ottawa, to create this grouping. After the Great War, communities all over Canada began to erect memorials, many of them reproductions of original work by Emmanuel Hahn, who designed for the Thompson Monument Company as well as teaching. On the left, we see Tommy in his greatcoat in Lindsay, Ontario. In the middle is Grieving Soldier, one copy of which was erected in Fort William in 1921. And my family growing up there did not know that until the late 80s. And then on the right-hand side is the memorial to the lost boys of Malvern Collegiate in Toronto. Canada held an international competition to choose the design for its great memorial at Vimy Ridge in France. We can see in the small photograph some of the several entries. Emmanuel Hahn produced one of them, but the design was awarded to, the commission was awarded to Walter Allward, with whom Emmanuel had worked as a younger sculptor in the teens. On the lower left-hand side, we see the sculpting of some of the figures, and the big view shows us the finished monument in France today. Larger Canadian cities also sponsored monument design competitions of their own. And in Winnipeg, this resulted in great controversy. In 1925, the prize-winning design on the left caused a national uproar when it turned out to be the work of the German-born Hahn. When the competition was reopened in 1927, the committee was delighted by the work of a young woman born in Canada, shown in the middle, until they found out that in private life, she was Mrs. Hahn. Eventually, they settled for a very undistinguished, non-figurative third-place winner by a local man who had been born in Britain. Despite the bad publicity from this inauspicious start to her career, Elizabeth produced many highly regarded works in the late 1920s and early 1930s. So much so that in 1934, she was invited to enter the competition for the Welland-Crowland Monument. Her winning design was described as the last great World War I monument in Canada. It was unveiled the day after the opening shots of World War II. It is unique in depicting both a male soldier, man the defender, and a female figure, woman the giver, who represents the service of those on the home front who supported the soldiers overseas. Elizabeth continued this commemoration of partnership when she was asked by the Niagara Parks Commission to design a monument to John Graves Simcoe. She persuaded the commissioners that it should include the figure of his wife, Elizabeth Willem Simcoe. And so the monument is dedicated to both of them. 12-year-old Kennifer posed in her galoshes when her mother needed a model for Simcoe in his riding boots. In 1955, Elizabeth won the competition to sculpt Canada's official monument to King George VI, which, like the Simcoe Monument, is found in the Niagara area. And she was commissioned to create Canada's tribute medallion to John F. Kennedy after his assassination. If you look very closely at that medal, you can see that under his neck are the initials EWW. Although figurative work was important throughout Elizabeth's career, right from the beginning, she became well known for her smaller landscape sculpture. Like the Group of Seven, she wanted to express the essence of Canada in a modern idiom, but she was unique in doing this in 3 dimensions. She also chose to finish these works in the metals of the Canadian Shield, rather than the more traditional bronze. Northern Island of 1927 was meant to be displayed on a base of black marble or glass to represent the water flowing around a small island hosting a single windswept tree. Even without such a base, the form of the sculpture suggests the water out of which the glaciated rock arises. In 2003, the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame worked with Kennifer to adapt a miniature version of Northern Ireland as the award for their inductees. And here we see the band Rush when they were inducted into the hall in 2010 with their award. Reef and Rainbow, first finished in plaster in 1927, was Elizabeth's 7th work to be cast in tin. Tin has been prized since antiquity as the ingredient that hardens copper into bronze, but it is extremely rare. In 1935, when the tin casting was first exhibited, the 6th form boys of Upper Canada College were asked to look at it and write essays in critique. Elizabeth took the time to respond to their work seriously, as she herself was a teacher, and these boys were the future captains of industry who would be the future patrons of art in Canada. She wrote that she was able to make this innovation of casting in pure tin because today we mine large quantities of tin in Canada. It is one of our most valuable natural resources and is a beautiful material for our plastic expression. Like gold, it will not tarnish on exposure to ordinary air. With this sculpture, she depicts not only the solid rock, but the ephemeral clouds of an afternoon in late summer, and even the refracted light forming the arc of the rainbow. Passing Rain of 1929 was an island bas-relief, here rendered in marble at the request of the National Gallery of Canada. Again, she included weather elements in the form of slanting rain that implies the strength of the wind blowing the clouds across Georgian Bay. With Dead Tree and Rock of 1929, she returned to sculpture in the round, this time also modeling the water swirling past the tree clinging to the rock. This work was cast in aluminum. Finally, in 1930, she stylized all of these elements of sky, water, rock, and tree into her relief called Dead Tree. A cast of this large medallion was erected by the York Mills Valley Association as their centennial project in 1967. Hahn and Wood also adapted this design for printing as their Christmas cards for several years. And on the right-hand side, we can see an example of that little card that she sent to her sister Elmo in 1930. Even when Elizabeth was focused on figurative work, she often included landscape elements in the sculpture. The Welland Monument includes pine bushes and sheaves of wheat to represent the land being defended by the trench mortar. For a memorial to Louise Booth, an art historian and longtime librarian in Toronto, she modeled a young pine growing from the roots of an old stump. And here we can see her distinctive signature on this plaster. Probably the most well-known, but ironically uncredited example of Wood's landscape sculpture is found in the 1935 design of the Voyageur silver dollar. Hahn, an accomplished medalist, had been commissioned by the federal government to design the first coin to be minted in Canada. He was asked to use the motif of a French-Canadian fur trader and a First Nations guide paddling together in a birch bark canoe. He consulted historic paintings for the canoe and costuming, and he used his student Carl Schaefer as his model for both figures. For the background and setting, he turned to Elizabeth, who suggested the island, tree, and aurora borealis, which do so much to unite the whole composition. She lent him her sketches and models for his reference. Upon her marriage, Elizabeth was quickly drawn into the world of annual canoe and camping trips north of Toronto. Often these were taken in the company of other artists. And as we see in this photograph from the island, there are many people out camping in next to one of the little huts. They're sheltered underneath a awning because it gets pretty warm there in the middle of the summer on those rocks. And on the right-hand side, we see Elizabeth in her white shirt, leaning over and possibly sketching. Every summer from 1926 to 1939, except for 1937 when my mother was born, Elizabeth and Emmanuel paddled to the island in the Pickerel, out to Georgian Bay, and sometimes east to Mazenau Lake, north of the St. Lawrence River. Everywhere she went, she sketched the landscape, as painted by her friend Will Ogilvie in the smaller drawing in the left corner. And Ogilvie was later a war artist for Canada in World War II. As expressed by my sister Sydney, the sketches that Elizabeth made during these summer canoe trips were her lab for exploring the form of rocks, trees, water, and weather. Over these years, she was developing her own graphic language for how to represent these elements. Summer after summer, she came back to the land because it was worth exploring and looking at and depicting. Elizabeth was not just imitating the style of the group of 7 painters, although the shapes in her work appear similar to theirs. She sought to develop her own style of representation that would be true to the land. And this is exactly what these landscape features look like. She had been trained to produce fine illustrations for a career in graphic arts, which was actually how many of the group of 7 painters supported themselves most of their working lives. At first, her sketches were studies of individual rocks and trees made in small notebooks. But very soon, she began to draw complete landscape portraits, the black and white equivalent of finished paintings. These were made using a few simple portable materials, a pad of 12 by 18 woven rag paper, and black lithocrayon, an oilier medium that is less apt to smear than charcoal. Not only could she sharpen the point to draw fine outlines, but she often used the whole length of the crayon to suggest planes and masses. This drawing technique totally engaged her hands and eyes and was good preparation for modeling the same forms back in her studio. Elizabeth knew that her drawings had value in their own right, and especially during the Depression, alongside her sculpture, she entered them into annual exhibitions and sales. She also submitted them for publication, as in this drawing printed in the Canadian Forum magazine in 1932. Curators have also come to value her landscape sketches as outstanding Canadian art. Both the National Gallery of Canada and the Art Gallery of Ontario have several of them in their collections. The McMichael Gallery's recent survey of female artists in the early modern era, the installation of which has just opened in Ottawa at the National Gallery, features many of her sketches. They are not often displayed because they are delicate. And last summer, Orillia Museum of Art and History displayed this newly acquired Elizabeth Wyn Wood drawing entitled First Trip Honey Harbor as one of the 50 objects that helped to define Orillia. Throughout her career, Elizabeth Wyn Wood built up a remarkable and beautiful body of work that stands alongside her sculpture. The family of Elizabeth Wyn Wood looks forward to more collaboration with the Orillia Museum of Art and History to help make these drawings better known alongside her sculpture. I would like to share a different screen and just allow the many slides that I've shown to click through, and you can just look at them on autopilot as we move to the next part of the program.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sylvie. Yep, go for it. So while you do that, many of you will know already, but the way we run this here is that if you have any questions for Sylvie, please put them in the Q&A, which you will see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may have to move your mouse to make that bar appear. So yeah, if you just click on that, you can type your questions in and we'll pose them aloud to Sylvie. We do have a couple of comments here as well, thanking you for your presentation. I see we have Hamid Julia joining us from Baltimore. From Julia. So yeah, so amazing to see your grandmother's amazing work is what it says. And yeah, it really is exceptional. We're so lucky here in Orillia that we can count some incredible artists across many genres, music, visual arts, and so many more. But she is certainly one of the most exceptional.
I'd just like to say that Julia is here at my invitation. She is like my mother in that both of her parents were famous photographers. So she's had a similar life journey of having to curate and make known. Well, her parents' work was quite well known, but being their daughter is a special burden that my mother understood.
Very cool. Well, thank you for joining us, Julia. We have a comment as well from Randy, who says, thank you and great talk. So Sylvie, I have a question for you.
Yes.
And I'll just pose it to you so that I can give folks a chance to warm up their typing fingers for questions. So as I mentioned at the top, International Women's Day just passed. And obviously, Elizabeth Wyn Wood is an exceptional woman and an exceptional sculptress. So can you talk a little bit about her influence that she had on female sculptors? Because she is sculpting at a time when not a lot of women are sculpting. Is that right? Can you talk more about that?
The thing that was special about her was that she was a professional sculptor. It was very interesting to me just the other day looking at photographs of the class of 1922 from Ontario College of Art to see how many of the students, like most of them, were female. And I know that in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was not unheard of by any means for women to take up sculpting in the same way that they might take up painting or other kinds of fine arts. But Elizabeth was somewhat unique, and sorry, I'm using an adverb for an adjective for a word that should not have any modifiers. She was unusual in that she made a full-time career out of it. She strove hard to set herself apart from her husband by always using her maiden name. And she was a full-time teacher or a part-time teacher as well. And she was addressed always as Miss Wood. It was only in private that she was known as Mrs. Hahn. It was not easy for her to have that job as a teacher at a time when people felt that a woman who had a husband who already had a job should not be taking employment away from a man who might have a family to support. But so many letters of recommendation were sent to the Toronto School Board saying that she was absolutely the one that they should hire for this job, that they in fact hired her, and she taught there for 29 years. She was teaching for 2.5 days a week, and then the rest of the time she was very busy working on all of her various commissions.
Okay. Okay, so we have actually quite a few questions coming in, so prepare yourself, Sylvie.
Okay.
The first one from Janet. How many drawings in all did Ms. Wood-Hahn do?
Over 100. We don't know of all of them. My sisters and I are still discovering things as we go through my parents' house.
Wow.
Yeah.
So a question here from Dawn. Elizabeth worked tin and aluminum, you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Given Sudbury, did she ever work in nickel?
Not that I know of. One of the things that she did do during her postgraduate year at OCA before she was married was work on learning how to cast tin. She was probably very familiar with nickel, but I'm not myself as sure how well it would have worked for her. She perhaps experimented with it and didn't find it be as useful, whereas tin she found to be very easy to cast and the results were absolutely beautiful.
I'll say. A question here from Beverly. Where did Elizabeth teach?
She taught at Central Technical School in downtown Toronto, and it was the alumni of that school are very proud of all the things that they've learned there, the many famous people that have come out of that school. It wasn't just a collegiate institute of academic learning, funneling people off to university. but there was a lot of hands-on instruction, and her work was in teaching modeling and also art history.
Okay.
So it was almost the high school equivalent of taking classes at the Ontario College of Art.
Oh, okay. This is a great question here from Deanne. Can you talk about the process of creating monuments? I picture your grandmother with a chisel climbing over large pieces of granite.
Well, she did have some experience in carving, but there are basically two ways to sculpt something. You either take a solid block of material such as wood or stone, and you cut away the parts that you don't want to create the finished piece. Or you build up the positive by modeling it. You might create a frame, and then you model clay on top of that. And then when you have your finished clay, you make your own model, your own mold, and cast it in, make a finished cast in plaster. That's still an intermediate stage. And especially in the case of a monument, very rarely does the sculptor work at the finished huge size of the finished piece. For instance, when Emmanuel Hahn was sculpting the Adam Beck Memorial, which is now on University Avenue in downtown Toronto, that sculpture is 13 or 14 feet high. He started out making what's called a maquette, a small thing probably about 20 inches high. And then once he won the commission, he sculpted it again in quarter size and then half size. And then in each of those cases, he sculpted it in clay and then made a mold to make a plaster casting. And then his last plaster casting was then used to make the final mold for the bronze casting. And that work is usually done in a foundry. And if the final work is to be finished in stone, such as granite or marble, that is almost always done by somebody who specializes in that carving work. And that person has to be as well trained as the sculptor designer, because that is very fine work. My grandmother worked most of her life with Louis Temporali, who was another student of my grandfather's. And my father, early in his married life, once went to Temporali's facility with his mother-in-law when she was having some final pieces carved by him. And he described the final details that she needed, and he worked away. And my dad said that it was as if two minds were both attached to the same pair of hands. So the casting and the carving, in the case of my grandmother, was almost always done by somebody else, but it was somebody that she worked with as closely as possible.
Okay. And I guess just to go a step further to clarify, the molds that were used, would those be just a one-time use? Would they be destroyed in making the sculpture, or could you use those over again? Well,
that process itself has quite a few steps to it. Okay. And the foundry will make an official mold, and then what they'll do is they will, using the process called the lost wax process, they will use that mold to cast a version of it in wax. And then the wax is used, which has to be checked by the sculptor again. The wax is then used to create an investment block, a block around it. And the molten metal is poured into the block that's built up around the wax. And the wax is immediately melted, and those hollow spaces are then filled with the bronze. So in addition to making the process involves making a lot of little channels for that wax to spread away. And then once you break out the finished metal piece from the casting block, you then have to carefully grind off those screws and gates, as they are called.
Okay.
So that process itself also requires a lot of technical training and finesse and working closely with the sculptor.
I had no idea how involved it was. That's fascinating.
Mhm.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions here. So one is from Barb, which says it's clear that Elizabeth Wyn Wood was a feminist before her time. What do you think influenced her to find the strength in her life and her work?
She had a very supportive family. Her mother was the one who found the house in Orillia that she grew up in. She had met the previous owners at a party, and she told them, "If you ever sell that house, I would like to buy it." And it was actually her name, Sarah Elizabeth Weaver Wood, that was on the deed. Similarly, the business, their dry goods business in downtown Orillia on Mississauga Street, was actually incorporated in her name. And it was run by her husband, but when he died in 1915, she continued to run the business into the 30s until the Depression just closed down the market. And she was always busy going to Toronto to buy wholesale things for the store. As far as Elizabeth's training, as a little girl, she was sick a lot. She spent a lot of time in bed. So her mother gave her the plasticine as a toy that would occupy her while she was in bed. And she also gave her lots of books on ancient classical art. So that was what it was those gifts from her mother that influenced her to want to become a sculptor. And she had to work to support herself with scholarships to actually, as far as I know, there was never any discouragement by her mother, and her family was very proud of her work.
Wow. Another question in a similar vein here comes from Rosemary, who says, "I've been curious about Elizabeth, but never came across information on her. How wonderful to hear more about the person behind the art. Just last month, I bumped into a sculpture of hers at the National Gallery in Ottawa. Did you find it difficult at all as a woman, and how widely known was her work?"
During her lifetime, she was quite famous. She burst on the scene with all these very well-reviewed small sculptures that I showed you this evening. And the National Gallery, when they saw, for instance, Passing Rain, they commissioned the final marble carving of it and purchased it. She was very outspoken as a teacher. She was used to talking, and she did lots of writing. Something I was going to say. So she was invited to be. She was the first woman who was invited to hang the annual art show at the Art Gallery of Ontario in 1930, I believe it was. So she and her husband socialized with all the other artists of the day in Toronto, and she learned very quickly how to enter competitions, how to promote her own work, and she did good work, and it was noticed.
Okay.
And I hope that when you saw this work at the National Gallery, you didn't literally bump into it.
I was thinking the same thing.
But I'm glad that you noticed it.
Mm-hmm. So then we actually have a question here from William. When did she move to Orillia?
She was actually born in Orillia. Cedar Island was still considered part of the city. Her parents bought the big house on West Street when she was a little kid, so that's where she grew up. She went to school, she went to boarding school in Toronto for most of her education, but she was always back on weekends and during the summer. And as an adult, the family home on West Street in Orillia was always a gathering place where other artists came when everybody was on their way up to the Pickerel River. It was the place you'd drive up to, and then you'd catch the train from up there. So Orillia was always a base of operations, and in fact, she's buried in the cemetery across the street from Paris on Coldwater Street, or Coldwater Road, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. Did you hear many stories of her experiences in Orillia? Places she liked to spend time?
No. She died when I was 4. And I do have a couple of memories of her, of interacting directly with her. I remember the sound of her voice. It was a low, deep voice. And I remember hugging her once. But I was not able to hear a lot of stories directly from her. And I don't have a lot of things from my mother about specific places in Orillia, but there are family photographs of her canoeing and boating with friends on Lake Couchiching.
Okay. Are you still doing okay for some more questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I told you there were several. So one here from Deanne says, what was life like for your mom growing up? Did she ever feel pressure to follow in those artistic footsteps?
No, she didn't feel pressured by any means. She was absolutely encouraged in her own taking after. Her parents were very intrigued by the drawings that she made. There was one time when my grandfather was having a professional photographer come in to photograph some of his and Elizabeth's works. And there was a drawing that my mother had made when she was in her mermaid phase, she was about 6 years old, that he was so impressed with this that he had that photographer photograph that as well. And the reason I know this was because I was looking through the City of Toronto archives for images of my grandparents' work and came across this thing that she had drawn. And we've since found many of her notebooks that they preserve. I meant to have it with me and I forgot to do it, but one time while Emmanuel was doing some small casting in his own studio, my mother had modeled a small mermaid, and he took that and he cast it in the same metal that he was doing his own work in. As I mentioned, she was in and out of their studios all the time, and she modeled for my grandmother at one point. And when she expressed an interest in studying architecture rather than other kinds of fine arts, they were fine with that. And she started out at University of Toronto, and later she transferred to University of Manitoba, where she and my dad met.
Okay, I have a two-part question here from Janet in regards to the sculpture that is on the poster for the talk for tonight. Yes. The first part is, can you tell me anything about the man who modeled for the stunning sculpture, and where is that sculpture now?
That man's name was Narcisse Pelletier, and he was a fellow student at the Ontario College of Art. He was a painter, and several of his small works are in the McMichael Gallery. And he later went on to become a professional photographer. And he was very close friends with both Monty and Betty. He went up to the island with them and took one of the photographs that I showed this evening. And she, in turn, made this monumental bust of him. And I believe that work was something she made for her own pleasure rather than because it was commissioned. And that that finished plaster is in the Art Gallery of Ontario, although I'm not sure if it's currently on display.
Okay, a question from Beverly. Where were the studios that they worked in?
For a long time, they were on Adelaide Street, East Adelaide Street in Toronto. They each had their own studio. The house in York Mills Valley, they had been saving for that for years, and it took a long time to get it built, and then it took even longer to finally build a studio next to it, which was necessary because in the early 60s, the building that they had been in for decades was torn down. Interestingly enough, my sister Sydney's architecture office is just down the street from the site where that building used to be.
Very cool. Actually, a comment here from Sybil. It says, Elizabeth with others founded the Sculptors Society of Canada. Yeah.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
And then a question here, and I think I'm gonna have this be the last question. And it's in regards to, it comes from Randy. And it says, Sylvie, I'm curious about the Blue Nose dime. Did Elizabeth Wyn Wood have anything to do with that commission?
No, she did not, to answer the question. But because of the success of the Voyageur silver dollar, and because Canada now had its own mint, a competition was then opened for designs for the rest of Canada's coins. Elizabeth did make entries into that competition, as did many other artists. But Emmanuel's choice of the Blue Nose was chosen for the dime, and the Caribou, which he had originally proposed for the 5-cent piece, was chosen for the quarter. And to go back to my sister Sybil's earlier comment about Elizabeth's advocacy of art by helping to form the Sculptor Society of Canada, a large part of the second half of her career was spent advocating for the arts in Canada, especially sculpture, but not solely sculpture. She eventually went to UNESCO as one of Canada's representations when that part of the United Nations devoted to cultural affairs was being started. And then she was instrumental in founding what later became the Canada Council on the Arts. So she was always writing and advocating for the rights of artists and the appreciation of the arts in Canada as a vital part of society.
That's great. Thank you, Sybil, as well. And she's added a little bit more. I'll just read it if that's okay. Later in life, Elizabeth bought an old house in Craighurst, which was her studio, that was later sold to a potter after her death. It was a studio for many years.
Yep. Yes, there was a point after her husband died when she was thinking, oh, maybe it's time to get out of Toronto. And she had bought this little schoolhouse that was not far away. It's not that far away from Orillia, with the intention of making it into her studio. But by that time, she was ill again, and so she never used it. Yes, I see that comment. Yes, that was Woodside pottery. Yes.
That's cool. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap things up there. A lot of comments as well. Sylvie just saying thank you for the talk. Yeah, so Sylvie, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have you with us this evening, and to hear stories about your own grandmother, who was such an amazing Orillian. So thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about her. I always enjoy being able to do that. And I always learn new things every time, even though I think I've seen all the pictures that I can find on the internet. There's always something new to find. Thank you very much. And in fact, I see in the chat that the city of Orillia is possibly going to name a street after her, and that's that is also a new fact for me. So thank you for telling me about that.
Yeah, I saw that one come in as well from Susan. So thank you, Susan. So I am going to turn it over to Trish now, who's going to wrap things up for us. So thanks very much, everybody.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say a very special thank you to Sylvie for being our guest speaker tonight and sharing with us the story of your grandmother, Elizabeth Wyn Wood. She was a renowned sculptor, advocate of art education in Canada, and Orillia Hall of Fame recipient, which we are all very proud of. She has such an incredible life and legacy, and thank you for sharing that with us today with your personal memories. A very big thank you to all of you in attendance tonight and for your ongoing support. Since we transitioned to the Zoom format for our series, it's been a format supported by many of our viewers, and we've been able to reach out to more households, not only in our wonderful community, but throughout Canada, and in some cases the US and further abroad. It's very exciting for us to be able to share our local history with so many of you. And remember, as Lindsay mentioned and Monica did, that these presentations do become available on the OMAH YouTube site, as well as through Rogers Channel 10. It goes into rotation. So a great opportunity to re-watch any of these series or suggest to your friends and family. So as you can see from the posters, we have a couple more talks coming your way. In April, on the 19th, we have Judy Humphreys of the Gravenhurst Archives returning again, this time to share the story and visual journey of the Ontario Fire College, founded in 1958. Then on May 17th, as our sites start to head towards the summer season, our guest speaker is Michael Hill, the artistic director of the Mariposa Folk Festival, who will present the 60 Years of Mariposa, which is just in time before the festival returns this summer. Michael will recount the past 60 years of the festival's musical and financial up and downs and provide insight into the interesting people involved in staging one of Canada's iconic cultural events, which was founded here in Orillia back in 1961. So some great talks coming your way. Be sure to register, and we look forward to seeing you back in April. Thank you so much.